Okay, today we're going to talk about the very last group of the original 13 colonies, and that's the Southern Colonies. All right? Remember, we had the Northern Colonies up in New England, which is Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. Then you have the Middle Colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. So today we're going to talk about the last 5 of the Southern Colonies. And here you go. This map is a little tiny, but you got Maryland right up there, to the north, right up here. That's not all of it. Okay. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then Georgia right down there. All right. But before we can go on, I really need to talk about the Mason-Dixon line. All right. So in 1763, they really need to find out, hey, what is the boundary? What's the boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland? Okay, what's the boundary? This line is going to separate the Middle Colonies from the Southern Colonies. So these two surveyors go out in 1763, Charles Mason, Jeremiah Dixon, and they go out and they survey the line. It's like 220 some miles of this border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. All right? You may have heard of the Mason-Dixon line. The land to the north of that is basically the north. And the land south of the Mason-Dixon line is considered the South. Now, does Maryland really seem like a southern state? Does our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. really seem to set in the South? Well, it doesn't. It's more like mid-Atlantic. But honestly, back at this time, anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon line was considered the South. All right? So this set the boundary, like I said, between the Middle Colonies and the Southern Colonies, the Mason-Dixon line. Okay, let's talk about Maryland. Maryland's very interesting. Now, we've talked a lot about colonies up in New England and in the Middle Colonies that were seeking religious freedom. And they're all Protestants, right? Remember the separatists, we also know them as the Pilgrims, came over seeking to separate from the Church of England. We talked about the Puritans, the group that wanted to come and purify the Anglican Church. We talked about the Quakers in Pennsylvania, but we haven't really talked about Catholics. Now, Catholics, as you know, because England has become a Protestant country, the Church of England, controlled by the king, is Protestant. So, if you're Catholic in England, you're going to be persecuted. Now, one of the guys that had remained Catholic is a guy named Lord Calvert. Lord Calvert is a Catholic, all right? And he's a lord, so he's a nobleman. He's important. And he talks to the King Charles I, remember this is way back in 1632, to grant him a colony in America. Please let me go. Let me take a bunch of Catholics. Again, we can go practice our religion freely, and, we won't be bothering you. Calvert had ruined his career in England by becoming Catholic. All right? So he's a man that is never going to be able to prosper in England because of his religious faith. So he planned on building a colony where Catholics could come and practice their religion freely. So the king gives him this charter. And what he does is he names the new colony Maryland, in honor of King Charles I's wife, Queen Mary. But he died before the colony started. But his son, Lord Baltimore, you guys ever heard of Baltimore, Maryland? There you go. Lord Baltimore pushed on with the project. Now, Maryland is a land of plenty, okay? If you've ever been there around the Chesapeake Bay area, it has got lots of fish and oysters, crabs, great fertile land for growing tobacco. And these guys are a little bit smarter than those guys at Jamestown. They build their city in a kind of a dry location. Remember, Jamestown was in a swamp, right? Well, not Maryland. St. Mary's, St. Mary's is in a dry location, so the people are healthier. They have a better life. They got plenty to eat, and they know about tobacco from Jamestown already, so they're going to be able to make some money. Now, Lord Baltimore he's a very generous guy. He gives a lot of land to colonists who bring servants, women, and children. Why? Because he wants the colony to grow. He wants it to prosper, and you need women, you need children, to make the colony grow. So he gives very generous land grants to colonists who will come to his colony. Now, like I said, Maryland was started for Roman Catholics. All right? But to make sure that the colony continues to grow, Lord Baltimore says, hey, listen, if you're a Protestant and you want to come to our colony, fine, come on over. We'll gladly have you. All right? But guess what happens? These Protestants come in and they begin talking of depriving Catholics of religious liberty. How is that? That's a fine how do you do. All right? Hey, Protestants, come on over. We'll let you come to our colony. And they go, thank you very much. And by the way, now we want to make sure that you don't get to practice your religion. How dare you? That seems really, really ungrateful. So Lord Baltimore asked the Assembly in Maryland to pass an act of tolerance. All right? This law provided religious freedom to all Christians. Remember, Catholics and Protestants are both Christians. Okay? The Christian community encompasses both Catholics and Protestants. So anybody who is a Christian gets to practice their religion freely, which means if you're Jewish, sorry, you're not going to be able to be welcomed into Maryland. All right? But all Christians can practice their religion freely. Now let's go back and visit our friends in Virginia. All right? Now Virginia, because of the tobacco, they're really prospering. They're really making a lot of money. And settlers are flooding into Virginia. But the best land has already been taken up. All right? And it's owned by wealthy planters. So if you're new, you arrive in Jamestown, you arrive in Virginia, the best land, the prime land, has already been gobbled up. So the new arrivals are forced to go west onto natives' lands. We kind of saw the same thing up in Massachusetts, didn't we? Remember with King Philip's War? Well, after several bloody clashes, the natives aren't happy with these settlers coming in. Remember, the British and the English are not like the French. The English are coming down there. Once again, I've said this before. They're chopping down the trees. They're plowing up the land. They're scaring off the game animals because they're farmers. So the settlers go to the governor and they say, hey, listen, help us out. We need some help, military help, to protect us. Well, the governor refuses. And why did he refuse? Because he's making a whole lot of money trading with the natives. All right? He doesn't want to mess that up. So he tries to get these settlers off the native land. Not because he really loves the natives so much. It's because he likes the money. Okay? So what do you think happens? Well, as you might well imagine, these settlers are furious, right? So in 1676, a guy named Nathaniel Bacon organizes a revolt. All right? And he leads these settlers on raids against natives. And guess what? He does not care if these natives are hostile or not. If they are a native, he kills them. All right? Oh my gosh. He just goes on this rampage killing all these people. But that doesn't satisfy him. He then turns his rage and anger against Jamestown and burns it to the ground. Oh my gosh. Right? So he's killed all these natives. He's now attacked Jamestown. But Bacon's rebellion only lasted a few months. And I'll tell you why. Nathaniel Bacon dies of dysentery, which is a really horrible disease. You get dehydrated. It's like really bad cases of diarrhea. You can't, it's just horrible. And he dies. So without a leader, the group falls apart. The governor then rounds up like 23 of Bacon's followers and hangs them. But guess what? He can't stop all these new settlers. Every day, new settlers are arriving, and they're moving on to the natives' land. All right, so he's going to continue to have this problem, this clash between Englishmen and natives. All right, now I told you that Bacon died of dysentery, right? Well, there's another story that he actually escaped and went up into Canada, where he became known as Canadian Bacon. Bum, bum. Nah, just kidding. He really did die of dysentery. All right. Now, let's talk about the Carolinas. All right, Carolinas. Well, in 1663, this group of 8 noblemen, again, friends of King Charles II. It's good to be friends of the king. He grants these guys land. It's going to be a proprietary colony. Remember what a proprietary colony, that's where you get land in exchange for a yearly payment, right? So they started a colony south of Virginia. Remember, the Virginia Company already owns that land. So there's this land, south of Virginia that they settled. Now, the new colony begins in two different locations, one in the north and the other in the south. Now, the group in the north, they're primarily poor tobacco farmers who haven't made it, big in Virginia. All right, so they kind of drift out of Virginia into this new colony, and they work kind of small farms. All right, so in 1712, this colony becomes known as North Carolina. All right, but further south, another settlement starts on the Ashley and Cooper River, and they name this Charlestown after the king. Remember King Charles II. It's later shortened to Charleston, right? And the colony became known as South Carolina in 1719. So now you have two colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina. But now the people in South Carolina are a lot different than the people in North Carolina. The people in South Carolina are fairly well off. Most of them have been living in the British West Indies, where it's miserable, it's hot, it's like, I don't like it here. It's too hot and humid. Where could we go? Well, they find out about South Carolina, and they take all their plantation knowledge of how to run a plantation, and they bring it into South Carolina. And these plantations rely heavily on slaves to work on the plantations. All right? So there you go. You got North Carolina, 1712, and South Carolina, 1719. A couple other things I'll mention real quick before we go. The Carolinas, though, I remember I told you that plantation system, and it begins to grow rapidly. One thing that they discover that they can grow in South Carolina is rice. And rice is a valuable commodity, but it takes a lot of workers to grow rice. And again, these are going to be slaves. They also find that they can grow a crop or a plant, which they call indigo. And indigo is a kind of a flower that you can take and you can make it into a dye, a beautiful blue dye. Okay, it's the craze of Europe. Everybody wants this blue dye made from the indigo plant. Okay, so you start to see more of these huge plantations spring up in the Carolinas, especially South Carolina, where you have a lot of slaves work in the field. In fact, at one point, I think slaves are going to outnumber Englishmen over 2-1 in the Carolinas. All right. In fact, South Carolina is the only colony of the British colonies where slaves outnumber the English. All right. Okay, let's talk about Georgia. Georgia is really interesting. Georgia was kind of a social experiment. Okay, there's a guy named James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe, he's a soldier, he's a social reformer, and he starts the colony of Georgia in 1732. A little bit later, almost, if you think about Jamestown, that was 1607. You look at the Pilgrims up in 1619. So this is, almost 100 years later. Over 100 years later, actually. All right. But James Oglethorpe, he's sitting back in England. He's looking around and he sees all these poor people in England. They're in debt. Many of them are in debtors' prisons. Okay? So he says, why can't we take some of this land in the New World and start a colony for these poor people who are debtors? All right? Give them a new start. Give them a new start in life. All right? So what is a debtor? Again, a debtor is a person who owed money they could not pay back. All right? So under the British law or English law, a debtor could be thrown into prison until they paid what they owed. Now, how are they going to pay what they owe if they're sitting in prison? All right? So, hopefully maybe your family can raise the money, or maybe your friends will have pity on you and give you some money. But if not, you might stay in that prison and languish for years and years and years. It's a terrible system. All right? James Oglethorpe feels sorry for these people. So Oglethorpe offered to pay for debtors to come to Georgia. That's pretty generous of him, right? Listen, I'm going to pay your debt, and then I'm going to send you over to Georgia, where you can start a new life. What a nice guy. So Oglethorpe, though, he says, okay, you guys are coming over, but I'm going to have some pretty strict laws, strict rules that you need to follow. First of all, farms could not be bigger than 500 acres, and slavery is forbidden. And these people are like, oh man, I can only have 500 acres. People in the Carolinas got like a lot more than that. And how come we can't have slaves? I mean, everybody else has slaves. South Carolina's got slaves. How come we can't have slaves? I got to think to myself, James Oglethorpe must have been like, are you kidding me? You're sitting in prison for crying out loud. But, the colony begins, kind of slow, grows slowly. So Oglethorpe changed the rules and allowed plantations and slavery. And guess what? After that, the colony grows quickly. That's unfortunate. I wish James Oglethorpe had kind of stuck to his guns, really stayed with what he believed, and we'd probably had a lot less problems in the South than we did. All right? But that's how Georgia started, as kind of a social experiment for debtors. Okay, we have definitely two ways of life in the South, okay? You basically have those huge tidewater plantations. Tidewater plantations. They're located on the coastal plains and along river. Because they're by the ocean and along rivers, they have easy transportation. They get their crops to market pretty easily. It has great weather. It's nice and warm, long growing seasons. Again, remember I told you about the rice and the indigo, so cash crops, but they need lots of workers to make profits. All right? And most of these are going to be slaves. People they don't have to pay at all. Now, I want you to understand, though, that very small percentage of people actually own plantations. Right? It says not everybody in the South's got a plantation. Only the rich people have the money to buy slaves. Slaves are expensive, by the way. And to afford, the land and the tools and everything you need to run a plantation. So a very small percentage of people actually own plantations. But guess what? They control life in the South. I mean, they're involved in the politics. They're involved in, they might be the governor. They might be the leaders of the society, mayors. And life centers around their great house, the great plantation house. People from all over come there. They listen to these guys. They make the rules. They have the money. So even though a very small percentage of the people own plantations, they control and dominate life in the South. All right? Now here's the majority of people. This is the backcountry South. All right? It's in the hilly and the mountainous region. It has good soil for growing crops, but it's going to be small farms. They might grow crops of tobacco, beans, corns, peas. They have very few slaves because, it's pretty small farms. And they probably don't need them. All right? These settlers here are a little more democratic. They treat each other more as equals. Do you think that those plantation owners saw these people as equals? No. They saw them as backcountry, hillbilly type folk, right? These people often work side by side with women, especially if you're out in, maybe 50, 60 miles from the nearest neighbor. Husband and wife are going to work together side by side. They're also going to hunt. They're going to be good hunters. They need to live by their wits, to make medicines, to feed their families. So they're going to be able to hunt the land. They're also going to know how to use the resources of the land very, very well. Now, as you might expect, with that plantation system, remember that was one of the two ways of life, we're going to see the growth of slavery in the British or English colonies. Remember, I told you that the first slaves arrived in Jamestown in 1619 by the Dutch. Dutch brought them in. Now, since the population of slaves in the colony were relatively small, especially in the 1600s, their status is really unclear. What are they? Are they citizens? Are they members of the colony? We really don't know, and we really don't care, because there's not that many of them. All right? In fact, some early slaves could actually buy their freedom, and a few of them became wealthy landowners. But by the 1700s, that plantation owner really relies on the slave system, especially in South Carolina and Georgia. And you see that slave population really begin to take off and grow, and now they have to address the issue of slavery. What's their status? Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about slavery. In Africa, slavery had been kind of part of their system for millennium, all right? Usually, a tribe would go to war, they might capture these people, and they'd become slaves. Now, these slaves were really more or less, became more like members of this new tribe. They might not be treated as equals, but they weren't, the slavery system was just different in Africa than it is here in the United States, all right? Or in the British colonies. Now, Europeans now are eager to bring these slaves. Remember, that started with the Spanish Empire because all the natives had died off. They need to bring in Africans into the New World because they're immune from European diseases. So they start bringing these Africans into South America, Central America, and now into North America. So the Europeans set up slave stations along the west coast of Africa, and they offered guns and alcohol and tools in exchange for slaves. Now, it's not going to be these white guys running through the jungles of Africa capturing slaves. No, not going to happen. So what it is other tribes who go and get other Africans and trade them for the trade goods that the Europeans are offering them. So these tribes would raid interior settlements and trade the captives for guns and European goods. And then these slaves, or these captives, are then crammed into these horrible conditions on these slave ships and sent to the New World. Oh my God, it's a horrible, horrible nightmare. Can you imagine, one day you're sitting in your village, next thing you know, you're clapped into irons, you're stuffed on this ship, and you're never, ever going to see your home again or your family. You're going to live a life of a slave. You're going to be worked until you die. It's a horrible, horrible situation. Now, tomorrow's lesson, we're going to talk about the triangular trade. But I want to just tell you that triangular trade, it's a triangle. Think of a triangle. Boom, boom, boom. Okay? The slaves that come on the triangular trade are going to be on what's called the middle passage, this bottom portion of the triangle. All right? So English sailors began to refer to the passage of the slave trades from Africa, here's Africa, to the New World, right, as the Middle Passage. Now, like I told you, slaves are crammed together with very little food, water, or hygiene, okay? And many of them are going to die on the journey. Some try to escape, some even try to commit suicide. And it's estimated that about 10% of the slaves would die in transit. Now, can you imagine you're handcuffed or you're chained together and you're crammed? In fact, let me just show you a picture real quick. Yeah, before I show you the picture, I'll show you the triangular trade. Okay, so here's West Africa, and this is the Middle Passage right here. Okay, the Middle Passage. We'll get into this more in the next lecture. Okay. Okay, so here's pictures of these people. I mean, they're crammed together almost like wood onto these slave ships. And there's deck after deck after deck. You can see them right there, right there, right there, right there. Okay. And you can see in this picture, kind of a close-up, they might have about 18 inches between them or above them. So they're forced to lay down. They're chained together because they don't want these guys revolting. And can you imagine, the guy is coughing. He has to go to the bathroom. Where is he going to go? Well, he's just going to go. And many of them are going to die. How would you like to be handcuffed or chained to somebody who is sick, maybe vomiting, maybe diarrhea, or has died? It is a horror story. It is a nightmare that we can't even begin to imagine. All right? So that is kind of the Middle Passage. Very, very sad. Sad passage in American or world history, actually. And if you think about it, about 10% of these people are going to die. So, probably well over 1 million people are just going to die before they even get to the New World. Okay, I remember I told you that in the 1600s there wasn't a lot of slaves. They really kind of don't know what to do with them. But as more and more slaves begin to come in, that plantation system really takes hold. The importance of slavery increased. Slaves' rights were restricted. So you start to have slave codes. They made rules concerning slaves' behavior and denied them their basic rights. They're not allowed to legally marry. They're not allowed to own property. They can't vote. They're not considered citizens. They're property. They belong just like an animal or a tool to the guy who owns them. All right? Slaves are not treated as human beings, but like I said, property. Most colonists didn't even question slavery, honestly. They saw blacks as inferior, and some thought they were actually helping these slaves by introducing them to the religion of Christianity. But not the Quakers. The Quakers are like, no, man. Remember, the Quakers believed that all men and women were equal in God's sight. So they say that applies to all people, white, black, native, Asians. So they opposed and banned slavery in Pennsylvania in 1688. All right? Most people, however, just say, hey, that's just the way it is. Remember, also part of this, guys, is that idea of predestination, where God has predestined everything to happen. God made me white, made you black. I'm free. You're a slave. That's the way God wants it, I guess. So we're okay with that. All right? We'll talk about that idea more throughout the year. All right? So that is the Southern Colonies. We talked about Maryland, which is a refuge for Catholics. We talked about the Carolinas. North. By the way, we didn't cover Virginia because Virginia we've already talked about, but that's a Southern colony. We talked about the Carolinas, started by a group of 8 Englishmen, started in 2 different parts. North, kind of poor. South, pretty prosperous because of plantation system. We talked about Georgia, a social experiment for people, debtors in England. And then we've talked about the increase of the slave trade into North America. Okay? That's all for today.